The traditional textbook version of Canadian history is a familiar narrative for anyone who was educated in our public school system. The creation of modern Canada to and through Confederation in 1867 was the culmination of a long running experiment in which French and English speaking colonists tried to live together peacefully. A new book is zooming out from that view beyond the usual suspects like John A. Macdonald and others. Here to talk about the making of Canada, an epic history and 20 extraordinary lives is author Greg Koabel. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me.
First of all, Greg, what inspired you to write the book? Why now?
Uh, it was a case of good timing, I think, considering Canadians are sort of feel like they're living through history at the moment in a way that maybe they haven't done in a while. And that's really what I was seeking to do with this book is look at Canadian history as a lived history, not a history of where abstract principles or constitutional systems are worked out, but one that's actually lived by Canadians and sort of creates legacies through their decisions that we live with today. Sort of the idea of a Canada that isn't hammered out in conference rooms in Quebec or Charlottetown, but one that's actually emerging from Canadians living in a particular moment and making decisions about their circumstances that we live with today.
The approach seems kind of familiar to me insofar as it seems like a move away from what we call great man history towards social history. Would you agree with that?
I think there's actually it was an interesting balance I found working through the stories. I tried to select Canadians that were, on the one hand, representative of not just themselves, but maybe a larger experience that many other Canadians shared with them at the time. But on the other hand, also ones that did make an impact. So I think there's a balance to be struck there between the influence that one person can have versus a nation being a shared story where one person can't determine the course of the nation. But I would say the theme that came across to me as I was doing the research and writing is just the real impact everyday Canadians can have by the decisions they make, by the actions they take, by how they view the world around them. So the great man isn't necessarily a politician or military leader, but entrepreneurs, missionaries, farmers, they can all have their own impact in a cumulative sense.
So, sort of expanding upon what makes a great historical figure, then.
Yeah, I guess broadening the scope of what we mean when we talk about historical figures that have had an impact on history. It's social history isn't necessarily a sort of amorphous blob of we're going to talk about a class of people or a a region that's having sort of an economic impact on what's going around them. But these are actually people too that are making individual decisions, interacting with the society they find themselves in. It's not just these impersonal forces of history pushing things along.
Now, there are 20 lives covered in the making of Canada, representing different components of the country's development, as you put it. What went into choosing these particular historical figures?
I wanted to effectively portray the diversity of Canada. I think you've got sort of a broad range of military figures, political figures, but also traders, merchants, entrepreneurs, explorers, fishermen. So I really wanted to get a broad spectrum of everyone that contributed to the Canadian story. Also, being Canada, diversity also means regions. You have to make sure each region is represented. Didn't want to have Newfoundland calling me up saying, "Hey, where's our part of the story?" So that was important as well, making sure we had the proper geographic scope for the story. To a certain extent as well, it was important to include the various nations that made up Canada, whether it's British, French, Indigenous, even migrants from America, sort of the broad range in that sense. So really, it was an attempt to cast as wide a net as possible, and it ended up being quite difficult to narrow it down to 20, which I mean, going into it, that seemed like a big number unto itself. But at a certain point, realized dealing with a couple centuries of history, 20 is probably as thin as we can get it.
Is there a second book in there with another 20, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I would be lying if I wasn't thinking about it. A lot of the material was drawn from podcasts I do on the history of Canada, the nations of Canada. And so, although the book goes up to 1867, the podcast has ventured beyond. So I'd be lying if I said I wasn't thinking about how all these other guys would map into the sort of the continuation of the story. Of course, all that depends on the economics of the book industry and where things go from here. But I would love to map out another few centuries of Canadian history.
We'll see how well this one does first then.
Right.
One of the 20 names that stuck out to me that'll stick out to a Vancouver and a BC audience, of course, is James Douglas, or as one biographer referred to him as Old Square Toes. What made you choose him?
I think he really embodies some of the most important and prominent themes that came out of the book. Probably, I would say, if there was one overarching point of the stories as I sort of worked through them, it was the practicality of the principles that underpin Canada today. They weren't just sort of idealistic visions that politicians had about how society works. They were born out of real people presented with problems and figuring out a practical way to solve them. And I don't think anyone represents that better than James Douglas, who found himself in charge of a fairly remote, fairly small British colony on Vancouver Island, was faced with a fairly large American presence to the south. And he really came up with some innovative ways to make sure that colony stayed British and ultimately became Canadian, whether it was promoting migration from California's Black community, taking advantage of the fact that Black Californians in the early days of the state were a oppressed minority, and maybe looking for a community they could live in with few more civil rights and political rights, or whether it was working with Indigenous communities on the Fraser River to combat the possibility of American prospectors coming in and essentially sort of creating their own mini state within mainland British Columbia. I think Douglas was a masterful, pragmatic politician. And I don't think he necessarily thought of himself as establishing sort of principles of pluralism and ethnic diversity in sort of founding what Canada would be. He probably saw himself acting as a British imperial official on the frontier of the British world, doing all he could to maintain its British status. But I think nevertheless, the actions he took and the decisions he made in forming the British Columbian colony really represent the wider Canadian story and really influenced what Canada became.
One of the things I like that you do in, I think, both the introduction and the conclusion is how you take those threads of history and try to make them meet today's moment. And I think one parallel you draw, maybe not so explicitly, is how Donald Trump likes to talk about Canada becoming the 51st American state. And in his day, James Douglas spent a good amount of time trying to keep the U.S. from expanding past the 49th parallel.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, he before coming to Vancouver Island, he cut his teeth in the Oregon Territory, which at the time was sort of disputed between the U.S. and Britain. And it was very much his personal mission to make sure that didn't happen in Vancouver Island, the sort of the loss of Oregon to the U.S. It really seemed like his life mission to make sure that didn't happen. And I think he would very instantly recognize Donald Trump's attitude towards the 51st state rhetoric and be at the front lines probably fighting off against that.
And of course, the Fraser River Gold Rush tended to make his life that much more difficult, but also speeding up the development of British Columbia.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the sort of crisis and opportunity of Canada that's sort of repeated throughout history and throughout Canada is the promise of natural resources and prosperity drawing in outsiders, and the danger that posed, especially when you have a powerful neighbor to your south that's also interested in those resources. Finding that balance of maintaining Canadian sovereignty while at the same time being able to develop the potential of the country into something that's prosperous and economically viable.
Now, you intimated at this a little earlier, but an underreported chapter in BC and indeed Canadian history is how Douglas attracted the first black settlers to British Columbia. And there was a couple of reasons for that, but let's get into that a little bit. What was the gain for him there?
It was a sort of interesting confluence of historical events there, where you had in California, which had obviously undergone its own gold rush a bit earlier, in San Francisco, was making the transition from a frontier gold rush community into a full-fledged state. And in that process, there was a definite racial component to the sort of legal system set up in that new state that really robbed Black Californians of a lot of their political and civil rights, which presented an opportunity for Douglas in Vancouver Island and mainland British Columbia, which underwent its own gold rush in 1858, about 10 years, a little less than 10 years after the California gold rush. And he was deeply concerned that most of the people that would be rushing up north to the gold rush would be American citizens. He faced the real threat of running a British colony where the vast majority of the people living there were American citizens, which creates problems that he could easily foresee. And he saw in the Black community of San Francisco a group of people that were deeply dissatisfied with the society they were living in, and were the type of American migrant which would produce the exact opposite of what he feared from white American prospectors, which is a community that would fight to preserve British Columbia's distinct status from the U.S. They wouldn't want to repeat what happened in California. They'd want to make sure that they retained the civil and political rights they enjoyed under the British system, which in a sense is sort of a very bold, innovative, tactical move on Douglas's part to find migrants into his colony, which would, although not being British subjects, almost immediately become allies in that work. And for a very important formative period of British Columbia's history, they were from 1858, when the gold rush happened, until the early 1870s, when obviously the Civil War completed in the U.S. and the situation changed quite a bit, and the Black population of British Columbia sort of went into stagnation and decline after that as American Blacks returned home. During that formative period, those were crucial years for British Columbia that really made the difference between British Columbia remaining British and ultimately Canadian in 1871 and becoming American, because I really don't think there's anything inevitable about that. I think, to go back to our great man of history, I think a few handful of people made pretty crucial decisions during that period, James Douglas being one of them, Mifflin Gibbs being one of the Black Californians that moved up, another. Their actions really influenced history in a way that likely was probably only possible in a place like British Columbia, where the population was relatively small. Individuals could have their decisions could have bigger effects on outcomes. But I think if there is a great man in history in the book, it probably is James Douglas.
And just as an aside, you mentioned Mifflin Gibbs, who was the first Black person elected to public office, I believe, in British Columbia, perhaps even Canada. He was a city councilor in Victoria, but then he ends up, like many, going back to the States. Why didn't they stay?
I think the reason they went back to the U.S. is largely related to the reason they came in the first place, which was the political situation in the U.S. and the Civil War and the Reconstruction that happened after the Civil War was really a moment of optimism for a lot of Black Americans that came to Canada and came to colonies like British Columbia, having been disillusioned by what was possible in the U.S. And I think the end of the Civil War and that brief period of Reconstruction where it seemed like it was possible to build something new, I think that encouraged a lot of people that maybe had previously given up on the U.S. to have renewed faith and to go back home and help rebuild the society that they thought was possible.
I guess the hopes and dreams of Reconstruction is a whole other conversation for sure. But what do you hope people get out of the book?
I hope they get a appreciation of Canadian history as a lived and exciting history. I mean, I grew up loving history, being very passionate about it, but it was really only in the past 5, 10 years that my interest moved over to Canadian history. I always felt Canadian history just didn't have the stakes, didn't have the excitement, didn't have the sort of engaging characters that maybe you got from world history or the history of Europe or Asia. But it's really been delving into the research for this book and other projects that have really opened my eyes to see that there's a lot more to Canadian history than I think is shown to most Canadians growing up. I think we tend to see Canadian history as something we're obligated to learn because we're Canadians. I don't think we get a full appreciation of how important Canadian history is outside of Canada. It's something non-Canadians can learn from as well. And by the same token, I think it's important to understand that Canadian history isn't insular in the sense that it's part of a international system as well. I think we can only really know our own history if we know the history of all the nations that we interact with, that have affected Canada over the years, not just the United States, but there's a long, long history, especially on the West Coast with Japan and China and India. It's Immigration is not just a recent phenomenon in Canadian history. This is something that goes back even before Confederation. So I think what I hope we get out of the book is a real sense that there's an international element to Canada's story as well. That it's not just some kind of national project that we need to indoctrinate our children with. It's an actual story that has meaning in the broader world.
As historians, as educators, is there an obligation to make the story more interesting, or is it a case of delving deeper and making it more relatable beyond just, as you put it, Canada not just being the product of legislation and constitutional conferences, but contributions, choices, and actions of men and women over centuries?
That's an interesting question. It can be a tough one because as a historian, you are creating narrative. You are making choices of how you present the story, and you do have to make sure that you're striking the proper balance between storytelling and actually revealing something about the past, sort of a truth about the past. I do think that while there is a balance to be struck there, I don't think those are necessarily opposing forces. I think good storytelling is a necessary component of telling the truth about the past, and I think as a different approaching stories from individuals, I think opens up more avenues to really get into what the world was like. I think you're presenting the same information, whether it's, data out of a ledger on a fur trade company post or the story of the fur trader who went off in the woods looking for pelts. It might be the same story and the same facts, but I think one approach really is much more effective at drawing people in. So I think storytelling is important, and it is a matter of choices on the part of the author, but I think also it's a necessary component of doing history that's going to be useful is you have to be a storyteller.
Now, as you close the book, you talk about how in some ways the story of Canada is a cautionary tale, but then you're also hopeful when you say that Canada's past does not determine its future. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the lesson to draw from all of this is that there are always options, there are always decisions. And although Canada is the product of decisions people have made in the past, we're sort of the cumulative legacy of all these people like James Douglas who decided how they were going to shape their colony. We're not necessarily bound by the legacies of the past, or rather, Canada has so many legacies that we can sort of pick and choose. So I think that's the important lesson to draw on, is not so much that history is inevitable, that Canada's path was set by global economic forces or by the geography of the country. It was set by decisions people made. And we live with those decisions, but we're in the same position where uh, we are going to make decisions now that affect what Canada is a generation, 2 generations from now. And I think I obviously wrote this book long before sort of the moment we find ourselves in now, but I feel like that, especially is coming home to me now, in that I think it's not going out on a limb to say we're sort of living in a historical moment now where it really feels like what direction we take is going to have a huge impact in a way that maybe it hadn't for the last 10, 20 years. So I think there's some comfort to know that we're in some sense in control. That decisions matter. Individual sort of engagement with the world around us actually matters and will determine what Canada becomes.
Living history, as you put it.
Exactly.
The name of the book is The Making of Canada, an epic history in 20 extraordinary lives. It is published by Sutherland House. My thanks to author Greg Koabel.
Oh, thanks for having me.